Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rick Hassan, and I'd like to welcome you to today's installment of the Spring 2024 webinar series for the Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA Law about whether we can have a fair and safe election in 2024. I want to thank Harley Ham and Ben Austin DeCampo for their important logistical support today. And I want to tell you about some of the upcoming programs of the Safeguarding Democracy Project here at UCLA Law. All of these programs are free, but registration is required. On Thursday, February 15th at 7:30 p.m., in conjunction with the UCLA Hammer Museum, I'll be speaking with UC Berkeley Dean Erwin Chemerinsky about my new book, A Real Right to Vote. This event is an in-person event. A recording will be posted after the event. If you'd like to get a copy of that recording, you can go to the Safeguarding Democracy Project website at safeguardingdemocracyproject.org and sign up for our emails. On Thursday, March 12th at 12 p.m. Pacific Time, Professor Rick Pildes will moderate a webinar entitled Business's Role in Preventing Democratic Backsliding. The speakers are Daniela Ballou-Ayres, Richard Eidlin, and Ben Ginsberg. And on Tuesday, April 9th at 12:15 p.m., both in person at the UCLA Law School and online, I will moderate a discussion on race and the risk of election subversion with Matt Barretto of UCLA, Sophia Lynn Lakin of the ACLU, and Spencer Overton of the George Washington University Law School. As I said, links to all of these events are at the SDP website, safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. They are free, but registration is required. Today, we're pleased to feature a webinar entitled, What Can We Do to Have a Fair and Safe Election in 2024? I'm going to introduce our four excellent speakers. Renee DiResta is the technical research manager at Stanford Internet University, a cross-disciplinary program of research, teaching, and policy engagement for the study of abuse in current information technologies. Renee investigates the spread of narratives across social and media networks with an interest in understanding how platform algorithms and affordances intersect with user behavior and factional crowd dynamics. She studies how actors leverage the information ecosystem to exert influence from domestic activists promoting health misinformation and conspiracy theories to full-spectrum information operations executed by state actors. Kate Klonick is an associate professor at St. John's University Law School, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, Yale Law School's Information Society Project, Harvard's Berkman Klein Center, and a distinguished scholar at the Institute for Humane Studies. Her writing on online speech, freedom of expression, and private internet platform governance has appeared in the Harvard Law Review, Yale Law Journal, The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, and many other publications. This year, she's a Fulbright Schuman Innovation Scholar for the European Union, where she's a visiting professor at Sciences Po and the University of Amsterdam, researching and writing about Digital Services Act and Digital Marketing Act. Charles Stewart III is the Kenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT, where he has taught since 1985, and a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His research and teaching areas include congressional politics, elections, and American political development. His current research about Congress touches on the historical development of committees, the origins of political polarization, and Senate elections. His recent books on congressional research include Electing the Senate, Fighting for the Speakership, and Analyzing Congress. Since 2001, he's been a member of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, a leading research effort that applies scientific analysis to questions about election technology, election administration, election reform. He's currently the MIT director of the project. And Kim Wyman is senior director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. She's a nationally recognized leader in election administration. She served as Washington Secretary of State for nearly a decade and is only the second Republican woman in state history to be elected to statewide office. She was appointed by President Joe Biden to serve as a senior election security advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. She began her career in elections as the Thurston County Elections Director. Today, we will be taking your questions for the panelists. If you have a question for the panelists, you're on the Zoom, please submit them using the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom. And now I'd like to welcome all of our speakers. It's great to have you here with us today. And now that I see your faces, let me first turn to Kim. I'm going to ask you each the same opening question, which is this. What is the single biggest lesson we should learn from our experience in the 2020 elections about how to have a fair and safe election in 2024? So, Kim, let me turn to you.
Well, 2020 offered us a lot of really good lessons, but I think if I was going to distill it down to one, it would be that election officials need to continue telling their story. What we learned in 2020 is that most Americans really don't understand our national election system. And this has really been the space that nefarious actors have been effective in casting doubt in the validity of results. And it's in part because of the decentralized system with over 8,800 election offices, and a third of them have less than one full-time employee. So, it's a challenge. You have very large jurisdictions like LA County down to really small ones that have one or two staff. So to rebuild confidence in the system, local election officials need to really share what they do and get into the nuts and bolts of their election office, because the research is showing us that people trust their local election official. They trust their state a little less, but they still trust their state. But when you get into other states, that confidence level really can drop off. And so I think that what we've seen is that local election officials are in this unique position to help restore public confidence. And, keep telling that story, what they do, sharing how they do their job. And I think finally, if I had a wish list for 24, it would be that local election officials and state election officials could not only say, you can have confidence in our state, in our county, in our municipality because of these things. And even though I don't know how other states run their elections and they're all different, I have confidence that the basic security measures we have in place here are in place in those other states. And I think that would go a long way in helping to start the discussion of why our elections are secure.
Thanks for that. I'm going to come back to you a little bit later and talk to you about those security measures, and also about kind of the relationship between the federal government's efforts and state and local efforts, which I think has come under some strain from outside forces, as we all know, in the last few years. But we'll come back to that. I want to turn to Charles next. And Charles, you and I participated most recently, done a lot of things together, but most recently we were part of an ad hoc committee that issued a report under the auspices of the Safeguarding Democracy Project called 24 for 24. We had recommendations in law, media, politics, and tech. We're going to put the link to that report in the chat for anyone who wants to see it. There are lots of challenges, and I think when you and I are in the same room, I am often the pessimist and you are the optimist. So before we get too deep into despair, as I worry about this conversation going, what do you think we can take out of 2020 as a lesson for 2024?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. I hopefully I won't let you down, at least as I start off here. I think that the thing that we learned from 2020 is that a well-run election gets you a long ways. And in 2020, we don't have to tell anybody on the call that 2020 was challenged in a number of ways. Most immediately at the beginning by the COVID pandemic, and then later on by the challenges to the outcome of the election after Election Day. And I think the thing that we learned in the run-up to the election was that if we put our minds to it, we can run a damn good election. And when you run an election in which you take care of the basics of the process, what I call the blocking and tackling of running elections, having clean voter rolls, getting the mail ballots out, having well-run polling places, et cetera, then at the end of the day, people can question the election, but they have no basis on which to question it. And that's the strongest position to be in if after the election, you start to have, people start to have doubts, or presidents begin to try to hold on to office and those sorts of things. I would add the other thing that we learned very quickly is that in challenging times, it's important to have the public behind you and to chip in. And this is something I hope happens in 24. I'm worried it doesn't happen as much as it did in 2020. But in 2020, we had people kind of coming out of the woodwork to work the polls, to make sure they got their applications for absentee ballots in early, make sure that they got their the absentee ballot application filled out right, made sure they kind of did it right. And so you had a lot of groups do that, had a lot of individuals take responsibility. I mean, so that's another thing that we learned that's really important. I hope we do that in 24, although I suspect it's not going to be as intense as it was in 20.
Right. I mean, I think with COVID, you had written that piece with Nate Persley, this excellent piece in the Journal of Democracy, the miracle and tragedy of the 2020 election, I think is what it was called.
Yes.
Like,
yeah.
it really was an all hands on deck moment. I kind of wonder if that same energy in terms of just making sure that people vote will be there.
Right, and it's hard to imagine. I mean, in some ways, it can't be. I mean, there's only so much energy one can give to anything. But I think that we learned a lot. I think election officials learned a lot. There was a story on National Public Radio just a couple of days ago about this kind of big event to get election workers in Fulton County. Now, whether that's a systematic thing or a one-off, who knows? But we're now getting into the period. I mean, remember, this is February. And people are not going to be excited about the primary season. We have however many months, 9 months, 8 months, in order to drum up excitement. I'm just hoping that it crests at the right time. I hope it doesn't crest the day before election day.
Okay, well, we've talked about things that maybe give us reason for hope. So now we'll turn to Renee and Kate and talk about reasons for potentially for worry and thinking specifically about the information environment. So Renee, what do you think we learned from 2020 and how might that help us in 2024?
Yeah, this was also a hope. I didn't realize we were switching to negative for me. I had a whole answer prepared.
Oh, go positive. We need more positivity. I just think of the information environment as such a cesspool that, but
well,
go ahead.
It is, but
cheer us up, please.
No, I was going to say, I think, election officials really recognize now more than ever the need to communicate quickly, right? And to dispel rumors before they ossify. And I think that one of the things that we saw quite a lot of in 2020 was ways in which, it wasn't even misinformation. It was rumors. It was theories that people had to try to explain an experience that they had. And the only people who are really in a position to respond to that are the people who are actually kind of locally there on the ground, who are part of that community, who can say, no, this machine had this thing happen to it. This, this ballot works just fine with a Sharpie marker, actually, that kind of stuff. And I think that the recognition that the local election official, who is still very much trusted within their community, has to communicate that quickly and effectively, to be that trusted voice and to try to clarify the rumor as quickly as possible as it begins to emerge. If you want some negativity, the one thing I will say is that the problem with that is that is a very easy prescription to deliver and a very hard one to actually execute on a lot of the time, right? Because it requires that you build those networks for doing that counter message, for doing that counter response now or 4 years ago. And so that, I think, becomes the challenge, right? Which is, how do you make yourself heard in an extremely noisy environment where very, very powerful influencers have incredibly loud voices across the entirety of the political spectrum? How do you ensure that your voice as a local official with the facts is communicated? Really requires quite a lot of networking, I think, and quite a lot of prioritization of communication, a sort of a first-class role in running a free and fair election.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Sharpiegate, because it does kind of bring back Kim's point about how election officials can be there to pre-bunk or quickly debunk rumors, whether they're Italian space lasers or bamboo from China in the ballots or whatever it is. That there is at least a possibility for counter speech. But turning to you, Kate, the information environment, especially when it comes to social media companies, is vastly changed. Not only did you have Twitter sold become X, and the firing of much of their trust and safety team, you see scaling back by Facebook and others. Do you think that social media companies maybe learned the wrong lessons from 2020, or more generally in thinking of the information environment? Like, where do we come out now?
Yeah, I think this is kind of a very interesting question about the private space and how much it governs this public concern of elections and democracy, and how we still, especially in the United States, don't have a great way of intermediating that. I guess not to put a positive or negative spin on it. I will say this, I agree with a lot of what Renee said. I will kind of put a different gloss on it, which is just the idea that I do think that at the margins, what we are finding over time in all of these elections is that truth actually often does matter. And as these things come into the courts and are adjudicated in the public eye, whether it's January 6th or it's Sharpie Gate or it's whatever, that there are these moments and these lessons where the collective conscious and the ability to kind of surface actual evidence is actually very important. So I think that's like a nice thing to say. That doesn't mean that the narrative is that leading up to the election or even during the election, but I would say that at the margins, that's definitely happening. The one thing that I will say that I say for all elections is that each election is sui generis. These are never controlled experiments. Like this is one of the reasons I hate polls. But I think that you just never know what people are going to do or what the circumstances are going to be in a given situation for any given election. And the fact that we have 2 years after the 2020 election have like now a very, very much decentralized social media space that I don't think anyone could have predicted. The buying of Twitter, the move to Mastodon, the move to protocols, not platforms. This is like one of these very interesting things where it's like, be careful what you wish for, which was that I think that for a long time, there was like this era, and I think it's still happening, of a huge techlash against big tech, which is not displaced. Like it's like it's a reasonable concern. And I think a lot of the antitrust movements and the DMA in Europe and some other things have been rightly placed to criticize these things. It's a reasonable criticism. But one things, and this came up in a panel that Renee and I did with Katie Harbath of Anchor Change and some other things a couple of weeks ago. One of the things that happens in a decentralized platform space is that you have to deal with a multitude more platforms to try to control a message or can try to control any type of bad behavior. And so the one place where big tech, maybe 6 or 8 large tech platforms that are all kind of like convening around best practices for a point in time, and I'm not saying all the time for censorship reasons and other types of things, but at least when it comes to mis and disinformation and sharing kind of behavioral things that are surfacing with bots or disinformation, that's actually a really great tool in our toolkit for democracy to have a handful of companies that can all do that work together and try to protect kind of the message. And on the other hand, there's always going to be outliers where things can get out, but that it's much more able to be controlled. I don't know how that's going to go this time around. And so I'm kind of, I guess I would say, concerned about that. And I don't think that's something that we had any idea about in 2020.
Well, let me stick with you and Renee for a minute on information before I turn to back to the election security questions with Kim and Charles. First, Kate, do you think that by the time we get to, say, I don't know, the end of June, when the Supreme Court issues its opinions, that what the court's going to do, there are a number of social media related cases out there, including cases involving Florida and Texas's law that would essentially require much more material to be carried without moderation. Do you think that what the Supreme Court is going to do could potentially change the information environment for before the November elections?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I think that that's absolutely on the table. So just for those who are not kind of read into the cases that Rick is referencing, they're the net choice cases, which are Texas and Florida passed social media acts that basically are must carry type cases. Must carry type laws, which essentially mean that the platforms have to, that are ordering the platforms to basically host speech. And these were to kind of like put a point on it, to like, they were Republican and conservative led bills that were basically to respond to, the idea or the story that the platforms deplatform or censor speech from the right more than they do the left. Of course, the horrible thing about getting rid of content moderation or kind of anything that involves trust and safety is that you really lose a lot of the ability to curb all the lawful but awful speech that is on a platform. And so the idea that you have, that that kind of, I think a little bit ironically, that you're going to have Texas and Florida, these like so-called conservative states, flooded with probably spam and pornography, and a bunch of other lawful speech that is currently taken down by the platforms in service of kind of making sure that like there's a so-called political balance on social media platforms, I think is going to be, I don't know, it's really impossible to decide what that's going to mean. There are many grounds in which the court could make that case, from dormant commerce clause to First Amendment grounds. And it's a little bit of a mess if you've looked at the briefs, massive amounts of briefing. But yeah, I think that like that will have a huge say in the environment, and then it will have a huge say in how, as I said before, the decentralized platforms respond to this, if they respond at all. It's not clear what this will mean for community moderated platforms that are small, let alone big platforms like Facebook or YouTube.
Renee, we've seen a number of kind of scary stories about this is the AI election, right? This is the election where deep fakes are going to make a difference. Do you think this is overblown? Do you think that this, that things are going to look fundamentally different for this reason than they did in the last couple of elections where social media played a big role in how people communicated about politics?
I think you have to think of it as three intersecting trends, right? So AI, generative AI has been around for a while, but it has recently been mass democratized. And that is particularly in images, 100% in text, to some extent video, and to some extent audio, right? So this is not necessarily uniform in terms of what type of content, but very much accessible to the average person with really minimal effort. We do see AI bots communicating as if they are real people. We do see them buying blue checks. We do see vast networks that some appear to be run out of places like Vietnam, mostly economically motivated spam, leveraging the technology to, produce reply guy commentary on Twitter. We see on Facebook the proliferation of pages very reminiscent of the Macedonian teenagers in 2016, where they are using AI generated content as lead gen, growing pages. Some of them do run political ads. None of them seem to be moving into the realm of politics. They seem to really be just trying to monetize crappy click farms. Interestingly, those click farms are also AI generated. So you have this sort of full spectrum machine whereby the text, the image, and the commenters are all run relatively inexpensively using AI. So we've had a real shift in capacity to create. The area where it becomes impactful is, does it serve as a mass distraction, right? Does it create a false impression? Meaning, do all of your reply guys start pumping out commentary implying that everybody believes a particular thing, right? That's something that might nudge a perception of public opinion. Persuasion itself is very, very difficult. So people might not be particularly persuaded by the content that they see. So you might see it used more for distraction than for persuasion. There's a whole variety of different types of techniques, right? But as all of this is happening, you have both the ability to create unreality. And then one of the things that we've seen, for example, in the context of Israel-Gaza, where this is a real world conflict that's playing out right now, is the denial of actual reality. So you can both create the image you want the world to be, and you can deny the world as it is by simply saying, no, that's AI. So that's the kind of environment. I think really it intersects, though, the other two trends are the decentralization of social media, meaning the proliferation of platforms. And as I think it was Kate noted, you don't see very many of them are really robustly staffed for content moderation. The idea, I think Facebook actually announced earlier today that it's going to begin labeling AI images on its platform. I'm very interested to see if this happens with my, my pages of content spammers. So I'm going to go and, check that out. But the question is, what is that going to do, right? So you're going to see these efforts to label on some platforms, other platforms will ignore it. So you're going to have a very kind of disparate set of policy responses to try to cope with a very, very new technology. And then the third trend really is the decline of trust overall. And this is where the sort of intersection of these things comes into play. If you want to believe the created reality or deny the actual reality, that's really going to come down to, do you believe the speaker? Do you have a relationship with them of some sort? Do you think the outlet is credible? And so I think you're going to start to see ways in which trust actually still remains the most important criteria in all of this. And so AI is an accelerant, a shift, a difference, but it's not necessarily the be all end all of persuasive capability in communication.
Thank you. Charles, we've now gone 25 minutes and no one has said the words Donald Trump. And it's kind of surprising because
Thank God.
the reason that millions of people don't believe that the last election was fairly conducted, despite the Herculean efforts that you described earlier, is because Trump has said that the election was stolen. Right now, we're talking on Tuesday, February 6th. On February 8th, there's going to be an oral argument at the Supreme Court about Trump being disqualified. Just this morning, a DC Circuit Court opinion said that Trump is not immune from potential criminal liability for elections subversion, teeing up the issue for the Supreme Court. We may have a trial before the Republican National Convention. So putting on your political scientist hat, as opposed to your kind of election administrator, detective hat. What do you see about this political environment, particularly the Trump factor, in terms of what this election is going to look like for confidence in the process and for the election to actually be fairly run?
Right. Wow. That's a big topic. I will note that I mentioned Trump without mentioning the name earlier. So well, to kick it off in a couple of ways. One, I mean, it's not surprising. You don't need to be a political scientist to tell that Donald Trump is really I think the most important issue and the most important factor in this election, not only substantively, but with respect to many of the things that we're talking about here, including trust, including threats to a well-run election. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. Now, whether Donald Trump himself can do any more damage than he's already done, and the whole movement that's lined up behind election skepticism, whether there can be any more damage, I think is a question that I, as a political scientist, have to ask, and that is to say, we've seen kind of trust go to a place and kind of stop. We've seen certain social movements organize, and they've been active over the last several years. We've seen kind of the apparatus of election denialism kind of kick in, and everybody, I think, kind of knows what the game is now. So if you're a voter, you kind of know that this is the election that we're going to be running. Now, what we haven't seen is voters really paying attention. People on this call, everybody watching the webinar intensely is watching elections, but we're all freaks. And so the effect of all of this is going to, if there is anything new, we're gonna see it probably, maybe even too late to do anything about it. It's gonna be in August, September, October, when attention begins to be pulled back to the election, and people recognize that we're not going to get anything other than Biden and Trump, and people have to make decisions. And so in some ways, I think we kind of know where it's going. We know it's going to be a difficult election, and that for those who care about a free and fair, safe election, that's kind of a reality to deal with. I mean, the good news in that story that I just told, which is that it's kind of baked into the election, is that in terms of belief about the system, I don't think that there's many minds to be changed at this point. The minds to be changed are perhaps the people who are, uncertain at this point. Don't know why they would be uncertain, but they continue to be uncertain. They're probably not paying attention to the elections, and probably won't pay attention to the election as we move into November.
I do wonder if you've long tracked how people's confidence in the fairness of the process is driven in part by whether their side won or not.
Right.
I do wonder if if there is a Trump victory, would lead to a crisis in confidence in election administration on the left.
Well, it's going to depend on the nature of the defeat or the victory of Trump if it does happen. And keep in mind also that when Donald Trump won in 2016, he still said it was a corrupt system, and so I could so it's possible, yes. I mean, if Trump wins, it's possible that there is a crisis of confidence among Democrats. But we saw in 2016 that Democratic trust did not really take a big dip after 2016, and that was directly in response to what Trump had been saying during the during the campaign. So if you're worried about that, which honestly I think in the months after the election may not be the most important thing, but if you are worried about the long term effect of of a Trump victory on trust, I have a feeling that there might be a couple of states, and it might come down to the states. For instance, if Arizona flips Republican, that's different than if Arizona stays Republican, because there's now gotten to be a couple of states that really seem to be the focus of a lot of attention. And so I think it'll come down to the details in many ways.
Thanks. All right. So one of the things I worry about is the potential for violence. And for example, if Trump is disqualified from the ballot by the Supreme Court. One of the things that is different, this time around is that we had the experience of January 6th. Another thing that's different is that there have been threats against election administrators, and so there's some attrition. So Kim, I want to turn to you and ask you, what about the election security environment? And in particular, given the kind of pushback against the federal government being involved in elections and kind of attacks on election administrators, the firing of Chris Krebs, and all the things that happened in 2020, where are we today in terms of election security? Talking now about like domestically, and we can talk about foreign threats separately if that's worth talking about, but just like what's going on here in the country now.
Well, remember, the foreign threats have not gone away, and I'm sure that that the entire panel could talk at length about that. So those still exist. I think what we've seen that has really been new since 2020 and has been nonstop since 2020 has been one, kind of the harassment and threats to election officials. And certainly we've seen an exodus of election officials that many have attributed to the threats. I now work at the Bipartisan Policy Center as a senior fellow, and that's one of the things we're doing a deep dive into to try to really quantify what we're seeing and make sure our assumptions are correct. And more importantly, kind of what does that exodus mean in terms of the next generation of election officials, and how do we train and recruit them to make them be really good at their job? So we have the elections that Charles was talking about that are really secure. What we've really seen since 2020 has been something that I have never seen in my 30-year career, where election officials are being harassed with everything from, FOIA requests or public records requests for millions of pages of documents that have an adverse impact on their ability to do their jobs, but also being the recipients of everything from, just name calling, you're a traitor, you rigged the election, you are somehow corrupt and part of the deep state, to actual death threats and threats of violence. And what was interesting as an election official coming out of 2020 and being the recipient of some of those myself, watching my friends and colleagues go through it, was we started receiving these horrible threats and immediately started reporting them to the FBI. And what we found was there are two types of threats. There are actionable threats and there are non-actionable threats. And the vast majority of these threats are non-actionable. So for example, I can say to you, Rick, I hope I see you hanging from a tree someday. That's not actionable. Now, if I say I'm going to hang you, they can actually do something. And I mention this because these threats are vile and they have been pervasive for the last 4 years. And they have gone all the way from local election officials to secretaries of state and federal election officials, employees in the federal government. And it definitely has had an effect. I mean, we've had trauma. We've gone through trauma. We've seen an exodus of people retiring maybe a little earlier than they had planned. And that is having an effect on the job. But I think when I look and try to be hopeful about 24, I think you look at election officials today, and these are people that know what they're signing up for. If they're new to the profession, they know what's coming at them. And if they've stayed, they know what's coming at them. So I think we're in a different space. We've been working, election officials have been working very closely with the FBI. There is now a task force that's been in place for about 4 years at the FBI and Department of Justice with election crimes coordinators in every state. So you have a way to report and really communicate with law enforcement. There's been a number of efforts. One of them I'm involved with is the Committee on Safe and Secure Elections through the Brennan Center. And what we've been doing is really trying to connect local law enforcement with local election officials and get them talking about their roles. I think one of the enlightened moments that election officials had is that we don't really understand law enforcement's community. And in talking to law enforcement, we realize that they don't really understand ours. And so those conversations have led to some really great things where each side is kind of defining their roles leading into an election and on election day. So going in, they're ready and they know how to respond to the myriad of threats that they're anticipating, and really doing tabletop exercises, practicing, trying to figure out if something bad happens, how are you going to respond and recover? And I think that's been the focus for the last 4 years. And I have confidence that election officials and law enforcement are ready.
Thanks. I'm going to turn to audience questions in a few minutes, but I do want to come to this question of foreign interference, whether that's through information activities or other things. And so let me this will be a jump ball type thing. Anyone can weigh in on this question. Is the foreign threat to the safety of our elections something we should be taking more seriously? Is this something that is overhyped? How should we think about this question?
I can take that one, maybe. Actually, in 2020, SIO convened a sort of, we actually asked this question on Brookings Lawfare blog. We had 3 people say it was very serious, 3 people who kind of offered the counterpoint. So I think that it has been a topic of conversation. How should we think about the nuance of the foreign threat? And we've discussed it rather extensively in academia. In 2022, we were working with Twitter still, right? So the Twitter Moderation Research Consortium still existed. And we examined networks, I think it was, if I recall correctly, 2 from China, 1 from Iran, and 1 from Russia. And what we saw was, the targeting of people across the political spectrum, right? China actually had some targeting of Marco Rubio and also targeting of folks on the left. The Iranians were very pro a particular left-wing cluster of candidates, really down ballot too. Actually, they went very, very far down ballot, which was interesting to see. On every platform that you could possibly envision them being on. The Russians, actually, since they have been, Facebook's been playing whack-a-mole with them for quite some time, were really much more established on places like Truth Social and the more right-wing ecosystem that normally does not go looking for them and does not proactively take them down. So what does this mean? If they're not taken down, they actually do grow an audience and establish relationships. So it is, in fact, the recognition that playing that unfortunate game of whack-a-mole actually does keep these accounts from entrenching themselves within networks, presenting themselves as fellow members of the community and doing things to either nudge people towards particular candidates or just generally reinforce beliefs they already hold and kind of, create tension at the margins. So I think it's not really a binary. It's not a does it matter, does it not matter? Is it going to swing elections? I don't think so, and I don't think it ever has. Is it something that we have to pay attention to as a threat? Yes, I think so. And what we saw with the Iranians in 2020 was actually them masquerading as the Proud Boys, right? Masquerading as right-wing actors, trying to create a bad impression of that, of that particular group by pretending to be the Proud Boys and targeting people, saying, "Oh, we stole your names from the voter rolls. It's been, you've been hacked. We're going to know how you vote," trying to intimidate people in that particular way. So you do see these dynamics, and I think it's, it's worth continuing to do the investigations. It's not the sort of thing where you want the discovery of the network after the fact to cast doubt on the integrity of the election because nobody went looking for it and nobody responded. That's one of the reasons why these integrity teams and these researcher relationships have existed since 2017, 2018 timeframe, and have done that work looking at foreign interference in the last, I guess, 3 elections at this point.
Okay, if no one else wants to weigh on that, let me turn to some of the audience questions. So a great question from our friend Michael Haas about the kind of dilemma that local election officials face. And I think it's not just local election officials. I think probably some of us have faced this as well. When you try to combat disinformation and say, the election wasn't stolen, you're accused of being a partisan. And so, how do local election officials, maybe this is a question for Kim, maybe it's a question for Charles or any of you, how do local election officials maintain that balance where they're being truth tellers, they're combating these false claims about, ballots and rivers or whatever it is, while not appearing to be taking sides in an election, which itself can undermine confidence?
Well, this would be my actual response to Charles. We're election geeks, just to make sure that we have the right moniker. I think that where election officials at the local level are the strongest is really getting into the weeds and debunking things and not having to say, these are the facts, this is the truth, just going through and walking through the basic 101 of what elections are in their jurisdiction. And, I talked about it a little in the beginning. That's powerful. And I think that most Americans think they understand American elections, but when in fact they understand the experience they have as a voter, and they understand that they go to the polling place or they get their mail-in ballot and they vote it and life goes on. But until something gets called into question or an election is close, they don't really stop to think about the mechanics of it until, especially when their candidate is losing. So I think that the power comes from election officials telling that story, sharing the layers of security measures they have in both cyberspace and physical security, how, like a bank, they're protecting your vote. How do you have confidence that right now in your bank account there's money? You have that confidence because of the layers of security measures the financial institutions that you bank with put in place to check against, what's on the computer against what's actually physically been put into your account. We do the same types of things with elections, and being able to get into the weeds and really explain that and have people tour facilities, having election observers, bipartisan election teams that work on ballots, sharing all those security measures, I think is what really starts to instill confidence at the local level. And what I'm hopeful will happen this year and in years coming, elections coming in the future, is that election officials will not only defend their own system, but will actually defend their colleagues in other states. I don't know all the laws in the state of Michigan, for example, but what I can tell you is they have the basic security protocols we have here in our county, in our municipality. And that is going to be more powerful than anything they could say trying to shoot down or prove to these people that the election was secure. It's going to take time to rebuild it, and we're never going to convince them about 2020. So we have to be forward looking.
Charles, before you give us your response, I want to bring in another question so we can maximize questions. It's about the insider threat to elections. We've had a couple of circumstances of election officials that have, say, shared software information with people they shouldn't have. Is there a problem with, trying to claim that we should, as Kim says, we should have faith in our fellow election administrators when some of them don't deserve the faith?
Right. So, we have to think about the safeguards in place so that we can trust that the results, even if we don't trust the people, right? And that's where particular procedures need to be followed, need to be in place, and need to be followed. I think the most powerful ones in looking back in 2020, especially in helping to convince courts, either in the immediate aftermath of the election or like in defamation trials, was in Georgia. There were 2 hand recounts of ballots in Georgia, for instance. And Coffee County, by the way, was a problem child in that hand recount. And it actually it shone a light on that county. So, I think that those sorts of procedures, post-election audits that are publicized, and can go a long way toward providing at least the paper evidence for the election at the end. At the end of the day, bad actors will act badly, and people who don't want to trust won't trust. And I think what I encourage folks to focus on in the worst case scenario is making sure that the election is trustworthy before um, an impartial audience, whether they be a court or a county commission or some other fact finder who needs to make a decision. Because at some point in some of these cases, it's going to come down to that.
Thanks. I think this question is, I think, first for Kate, which is we've been putting so much emphasis on social media, not just today, but we hear so much generally in terms of elections. What about old media? What about Fox News, Newsmax, cable TV? They get a lot of eyeballs. How do we think about that? And let me add in with my own question, not from the audience member. To what extent are these defamation cases actually serving to rein in false claims about election integrity?
Yeah, I think that I'll start with the defamation cases, which I think is a fascinating, and to that, I'm assuming that you're speaking of the Trump case with E. Jean Carroll, and then you're also speaking to like the Alex Jones case.
Well, and I'm thinking more specifically about like Rudy Giuliani in terms
Oh,
of
and the
the
Giuliani,
election
yeah,
and the
right.
Smartmatic case that's now pending,
And the Dominion
case
voting.
that went against Fox News. The ones that were more specifically connected to election lies. Not all election lies are defamatory. If you say the election is rigged and you don't say who did it, you're kind of indicting the whole system. But there's nobody. But these cases have been successful. Rudy Giuliani maybe is going to have to declare bankruptcy. Fox News.
Yeah.
Paid $787 million to Dominion, and there's still a Smartmatic suit pending. Just yesterday, we saw Project Veritas and James O'Keefe apologizing for claiming there was some fraud going on. I think that was in Erie County, Pennsylvania, if I'm remembering that right. So, does this matter for the legacy media? Is this the way that these things are going to be policed?
I mean, you'd like to think so, right? You'd like to think that there's someone who with holding kind of the reins behind these legacy media corporations that are stopping them before. I mean, one of my first jobs out of college was at ABC News, and we had to screen things past lawyers like on a regular basis before we published them. That was whether that was images that we attached to stories that we did to make sure that we had the rights to publish them, to things like making sure that they would just like pass muster and that we could say this about a person and that it wouldn't be put us on the hook for kind of a lawsuit. It does appear that there has been a change, but one of the things that I would say is that there's, especially in the US where the defamation law is very, very difficult to prosecute, is that there's a lot of dog whistling and there's a lot of gesturing, and it doesn't really matter. And especially if a lot of this is spread through social media and not these legacy platforms, I would say that that's, as Renee points out, you can have a bot that's not policed on Truth Social that garners some type of like 10 or 15,000 person following, that to that 10 or 15,000 person following can just speak whatever. It's essentially judgment proof. There's no amount of like defamation or even finding the person to sue them for defamation because they're a bot or something else coordinated. And so I just kind of think that there's, I think that maybe our best hope is like that legacy media makes an adjustment after these defamation things, because I think that that's not where the fight's going to be anymore, unfortunately. And I think something to have a bit of a reality about as we're kind of going through a lot of these adjustments to this media ecosystem, is that these are The legacy media is also completely dependent on social media clips and generation to to push its message out as cable subscriptions go down. And so these are, the power of these legacy media corporations is still massive, but it's small comparatively, and its audience is dwindling with every election, especially every presidential election. So I think that that's something to kind of keep in mind when you think about the power the defamation hearings or the defamation rulings can have.
I did see a statistic that the median age of the viewers of CNN, Fox, and MSNBC was in their 60s, which tells you something about the future of those media in terms of influencing politics. Renee, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on the kind of the old information environment and how that interacts with what we're seeing, because I think though, we kind of think of them, or some of us think of them as separate, but it's more of a feedback loop there.
Yeah, I don't think you should think of them as separate anywhere at any point. It is one of the things, we do a lot of work at SIO just on propaganda campaigns writ large anywhere in the world. And what we see consistently is just this integration between very academic 2x2. You have like the broadcast and social, broadcast and social spectrum of medias. And then across, funny enough, the sort of overt to covert spectrum of attribution. And all of these things are working to shape perceptions, to nudge people in particular directions. What you hope is that there is this mainstream sort of center that tells the truth and gets the facts out, because there is going to be this sort of partisan noise machines, and then the partisan social media influencer noise machines that are very much in the game. And again, what you see really, as Kate notes, is when media wants to tell a story, often it'll just go kind of grab a random comment off social media and pull it up, and it becomes some people on the internet are saying, right? And then that's how the story is kind of pulled from the realm of the internet rumor mill into the realm of, this is now, it is, a partisan outlet finds it advantageous, uses it, and then all of a sudden it kind of drops back down, right? Then you have like such and such is reporting that, and then it goes back down into the social media environment. And so it just kind of becomes this loop. Things are just moving seamlessly between them. You shouldn't think of them as separate at all.
We're getting close to the end, but I want to circle to a question that comes back to something I talked about earlier. I asked all of you about foreign interference, and most of the answers were kind of about the information issues, but the watcher wants to know about the actual voting machines. Maybe I'll turn to you, Charles. I know you just finished a paper on the machinery of voting. Back when I read your bio, we talked about the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, which was studying hanging chads. So you've been at this for a while. Should we worry about the machines? And do you think that we're in a better position now, or a worse position now than we were in 2020 in terms of the security of our machinery that's used both for casting ballots and for counting ballots?
Well, I think, at the 30,000-foot level, the machines have been getting better. Better and better since the 2020, the 2000 election with the hanging chads. That's for sure. I think that the most important trend over the years has been the shift to paper ballots that are then scanned, and that gives us the opportunity to recount by hand or by machine if there are questions. It gives us an opportunity to kind of shift gears, as it were, if there is a technological breakdown, because we do have those we do have that paper backup, so to say. So I think that's the big shift. I think that the computer science community and actually the other election geeks, again, make the point that you really should not run an election in which you have to trust anything, whether it be whether it be even the machines or the personnel or the seals on the machines. You need ways of confirming the results, right? And so that's the important thing about more paper, is that if there is a problem like there was in Antrim County in 2020, where there was a misconfigured process to read in the results, or whether it be in Georgia, where there's keep pushing on the election denial, we have much better equipment to to confirm the results of the elections right now.
Kim, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Actually, I do. Yeah, I think Charles is absolutely right. I think that the biggest challenge is just the sheer attack surface that that our adversaries, both foreign and domestic, have related to everything, electronic. And paper ballots are just the strength and the backbone of the election system. But all it's going to take, and I'm sure that our adversaries are focused on it, is hitting one of the over 8,800 local election offices, and they're hitting them all the time right now anyway, trying to get into voter registration systems, trying to get into websites, so that they can create the illusion that they've somehow hacked into the voting system. And I think that's the biggest threat, is just this appearance. All they have to do is get in, have some sort of breach or hack, which is, the odds are in their favor. They just have to get it right once. Election officials have to get it right 100% of the time. It's going to happen. And then they amplify that. And then they go into a narrative that, see, here's your voter registration system. We got into it. And we also changed the votes. Most Americans don't understand that there's an air gap between the tabulation systems and your vote and the hackers, but it doesn't matter at that point. So I think that those perceptions are going to be the hardest thing to overcome, and probably the most effective thing that our adversaries can do.
Well, that's interesting because it loops back in the question of actual, physical security with the question of disinformation. We're gonna have to leave it there. This has been a great discussion. I have to say, I don't feel worse about our elections than I did coming in. So that's something. I'm low bar, but I do not feel worse. So thank you all. I've got Kim Wyman, Charles Stewart, Renee DiResta, and Kate Klonick. Let me remind you all that the next event coming up is February 15th at the Hammer Museum. All of our events are at the Safeguarding Democracy Project website, safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. I'm Rick Hasson. Thank you all so much. We'll see you again next time. Thank you to our speakers. Bye-bye.